Before the clash of steel, before the war cries echoed across blood-soaked fields, something far darker unfolded behind the canvas walls of Roman military tents. According to preserved accounts and archaeological evidence, some Roman soldiers engaged in rituals so depraved they barely seem believable. Rituals involving the sexual violation of young captives, often boys, believed to possess spiritual energy. These acts weren't random cruelty. They were pre-battle customs, believed to imbue the soldier with divine favor, strength, and protection. In the shadow of empire, religion was not a sanctuary, it was a weapon. Superstition merged with brutality. Soldiers believed that dominating the weak, especially those considered pure or innocent, transferred power. The idea was simple and sickening. By defiling what was untouched, a man could absorb its purity and turn it into personal strength. The victims, usually prisoners of war or enslaved youths, were chosen deliberately. Their suffering was part of the ritual, their screams considered proof that the offering had been accepted. These rites weren't hidden in shame. They were witnessed, sanctioned, even ritualized. Some were written about with cold detachment in military records and personal letters. Others were etched into graffiti across border camps, buried beneath centuries of silence. Modern readers might dismiss these claims as exaggerated slander from Rome's enemies, but archaeology has confirmed far too much to deny. Burned offerings mixed with human remains, tents stained with fluids not explained by battle, bound skeletons of adolescent boys found outside command posts. These weren't isolated atrocities. They were part of a brutal theology of domination, performed by the very men we often remember as the defenders of civilization. This is the side of Rome the textbooks don't mention, the empire built not just on conquest, but on ritualized cruelty hidden behind polished armor. 2. Sex as a weapon of Romanization, conquest in Rome, was never just about land, it was about erasure. When the Roman army marched into foreign territory, they didn't only dismantle governments and crush rebellions. They rewrote bloodlines. Soldiers were trained not only to fight, but to dominate every part of their enemy, including the body. Sexual violence became a deliberate tool of Romanization, a tactic used to fracture identity, humiliate leadership, and embed Roman power into the DNA of the conquered. Male captives were often raped in front of their communities. It wasn't about pleasure, it was humiliation by design. To be sexually violated was to be stripped of manhood, honor, and the right to lead. For tribal societies where masculinity defined hierarchy, these acts shattered resistance without lifting a sword. A broken leader couldn't return to his people as anything but a shell. The message was clear. Rome doesn't just conquer, you don't even own your own body anymore. Women faced another fate. They were not only violated, they were forced to carry the conqueror's seed. Roman soldiers impregnated them to disrupt lineage, to make every future generation half-Roman, by blood if not by choice. In doing so, they dismantled the very idea of cultural purity. A child born of violence still counted to Rome. It was strategy in its most brutal form, breed the enemy into submission. The military knew exactly what it was doing. Officers turned a blind eye. Some even encouraged it. Manuals and field reports refer to these actions without shame as necessary tools of pacification. These weren't rogue atrocities. They were military policy in practice. Rome didn't just defeat nations, it buried them beneath a legacy of forced assimilation. And at the center of that legacy was the body used, broken, and repurposed to serve the empire. 3. The shame of the passive man. In the Roman military, masculinity wasn't just about courage, it was about control. To be a man meant to dominate in every arena, in battle, in politics, and especially in sex. A Roman soldier could take male slaves to bed and still be seen as honorable so long as he was the one doing the penetrating. The moment that dynamic flipped, everything changed. To be sexually passive was to invite infamia, a label more damning than any battlefield defeat. It meant legal disgrace, social exile, and career death. Soldiers caught or even rumored to have submitted in sex lost their right to testify in court, to inherit property, or to hold command. In the eyes of Roman law, they became untrustworthy, weak, unmanly, and un-Roman. This wasn't private shame. It was policed publicly and violently. Accusations didn't require proof. A whisper could start an inquiry. A joke among comrades could spark a tribunal. The military took these rumors seriously because passivity was seen as a breach of discipline. If a man couldn't control the bedroom, how could he control a legion? Punishments varied. Some were discharged in disgrace. Others were flogged or humiliated before their units. A few were executed not for the act itself, but for bringing dishonor to the uniform. It wasn't about morality. It was about hierarchy. Submission of any kind was incompatible with Roman virtue. Graffiti in military camps mocked suspected soft men. Satirical plays cast them as buffoons. Even literature by Roman elites reinforced the same message. A real man gives, never receives. This rigid code turned sex into a battlefield of its own, where every act reinforced dominance and any slip meant total ruin. In Rome, being conquered in bed meant being conquered everywhere. In the ranks of the Roman military, dominance wasn't just enforced with weapons, it was displayed through flesh. Among the most disturbing symbols of power were the delicate young slave lads taken for their looks, broken for obedience, and kept as sexual trophies. These boys weren't partners, they were status objects, reminders that in Rome, control was everything. Selected for soft features and submissive temperaments, delicati were stripped of identity the moment they were captured. Their names were replaced with nicknames. Their clothes were exchanged for silks or jewelry. Their voices were quieted unless spoken to. They were trained to flatter, to entertain, and to submit without hesitation. There was nothing hidden about this practice. In many camps, delicati were openly paraded, shown off like prized animals. Officers boasted about their beauty. Commanders offered them as rewards. Some were forced to dance during victory feasts, their humiliation treated as amusement for the hardened killers they served. What Rome called custom was in reality a sanctioned system of exploitation. These boys were purchased, traded, gifted between men of rank. Their worth depended solely on how well they served. If they resisted, they were beaten. If they aged, they were replaced. Few survived long enough to see manhood. Roman literature mentions them in passing, never with guilt, only pride. To own a delicatus was to prove your strength. To use one was to assert superiority. The suffering behind those eyes? Irrelevant. They were ghosts in silk, boys without names. Lives measured by how quietly they obeyed and how convincingly they played their part. For the Roman soldier, the delicatus wasn't human. He was a mirror, reflecting the brutal beauty of conquest. And when he cracked, he was thrown away without thought, without record, without mercy. 5. Public rape as entertainment. In the outer edges of the empire, where Roman law blurred into raw domination, cruelty became performance. Captured enemies, especially rebels, weren't simply executed. They were stripped, violated, and displayed. Public rape became a spectacle, a punishment designed not just to destroy a man's body, but to erase his dignity in front of those he once led. Roman outposts turned humiliation into ritual. After suppressing uprisings, soldiers paraded the defeated through camp squares. The victims, often tribal leaders or resistant warriors, were bound and exposed. Their fate wasn't swift death, it was degradation. Centurions gathered the troops, bets were placed, and the act of rape unfolded with cheers, not horror. This was no secret, it was sanctioned. Commanders allowed it, sometimes ordered it, because it served a clear purpose: fear. By making an example of the proudest enemy, they shattered the will of the watching. The message was unmistakable. Resist Rome, and we won't just kill you, we'll unmake you. Lower-ranking soldiers watched closely. The violence wasn't just for the enemy, it was a warning to them as well. Discipline wasn't maintained with honor, it was ruled by terror. Today's victim could be tomorrow's traitor. The cruelty often escalated. Some victims were left alive, sent back to their people mutilated and broken. Others were filmed in the Roman equivalent of graffiti etched into stone walls or mocked in military songs. It wasn't enough to win. Rome had to humiliate. There were no trials, no hesitation. Once stripped of their weapons, enemies lost their humanity too. Rape became both punishment and entertainment, woven into the culture of the legion like the glint of a polished sword. To Rome, fear was the most effective armor, and nothing spread fear faster than turning a rebel into a public warning defiled, broken, and left to rot. Sixth fustuarium, the sexual execution. In the Roman army, disobedience wasn't merely punished, it was erased. The penalty for desertion, theft, or betrayal was fustuarium, a savage execution where the condemned was beaten to death by his fellow soldiers with clubs and stones. But beneath the surface of this punishment lay a darker ritual, one rarely written, but widely whispered. Before the fatal blows began, the condemned was often raped. These were not spontaneous acts of vengeance. They were calculated degradations designed to strip the man of his honor before stripping him of life. Fellow soldiers, once his brothers in arms, were ordered or allowed to violate him, not for pleasure but for humiliation, to mark his death not just as a punishment but as a warning. Roman military culture was obsessed with reputation. A soldier could be feared, hated, even brutal, but he could not be passive, weak, or sexually submissive. To be raped before execution was the ultimate disgrace. It ensured that even in death, he carried shame, his legacy broken, his name blackened. Official records are silent on this practice. Roman historians preferred to polish the image of their legions, but in the margins of surviving texts and in the cynical lines of satirical poems, the truth leaks through. Graffiti and barracks hint at it. Rumors in camp scrolls confirm it. Fustuarium wasn't just physical punishment, it was ritualized, erasure. The victim's screams served two purposes: to satisfy vengeance and to solidify control. Once dishonored, he was no longer a man, no longer a soldier, no longer Roman. The beating that followed wasn't just death, it was finality. No mourning, no burial rites, just silence. Rome didn't just kill its traitors, it defiled them, ensuring that their bodies were broken and their memory burned from history. 7. The legion's legalized brothels. Wherever Roman legions set foot, brothels weren't far behind. They were as essential to the military operation as rations or weapons. Some were official, run under state supervision. Others were makeshift, operated by merchants or officers, but most functioned the same way women were the commodity, and consent was a forgotten concept. Many of these brothels were filled with captives, women taken during raids and spared not out of mercy, but because their bodies could be repurposed. Instead of being executed, they were sold into forced sexual labor. Stripped of names, identities, and protections, they became tools for relief, discipline, and reward. The system was efficient. Soldiers were given discounted rates. The army saw it as a way to maintain morale. Some commanders even used brothel access. As a form of incentive, good behavior earned privilege, and women were the currency. There was no illusion of choice. Rank replaced permission. Gold replaced consent. Inside these walls, brutality became routine. Women were branded, catalogued, and rotated. Some were used until their health failed, then discarded or sold off again. Injuries were ignored. Pregnancies were terminated without thought. Silence was mandatory. No laws protected them. Roman legal codes treated brothel slaves as property. Killing one carried the same penalty as damaging livestock. Reports from occupied provinces show how common the practice was. Towns rebuilt themselves around military brothels, feeding off the soldiers' pay and the women's suffering. To the outside world, Rome spoke of civilization and order. But inside its camps, exploitation was organized, regulated, and justified. These brothels weren't shameful secrets. They were policy. The empire didn't just march with banners and steel, it marched with cages. And inside those cages were women, forgotten by history but essential to Rome's conquest machine. Mock marriages to virgin slaves. When Roman soldiers wanted to commemorate victory, they didn't just raise flags or drink wine, they staged weddings, not to lovers, but to captive girls. These weren't unions. They were spectacles of control, with the illusion of ceremony wrapped tightly around acts of ritualized rape. The chosen girl was always young, always untouched. Her virginity made her valuable, not as a person, but as a symbol. She would be washed, dressed in bridal white, and adorned with the garlands of a Roman bride. Soldiers watched as she was paraded through the camp, not with honor, but with anticipation. The ceremony mimicked tradition. Vows were spoken, laughter rang out. But it wasn't a celebration of love, it was a performance of dominance. Once the farce ended, the bride was taken, not in private, not gently, but in full view of fellow soldiers who cheered, jeered, and sometimes joined. Letters from the front lines recorded these rituals with disturbing detachment. Graffiti mocked the girl's pain. Inscriptions celebrated who deflowered whom, like tally marks on a wall. There was no shame, only pride. These mock marriages became a perverse tradition, rapes dressed in robes, pain buried under protocol. The purpose was never about intimacy. It was about humiliation. The girl's body became a tool to mark the transition from conquest to complete control. Her suffering confirmed Rome's dominance, and when it was over, she was cast aside, bloodied, broken, and silenced. To Rome, these acts weren't crimes, they were customs, designed to entertain, to reward, and to remind the ranks of their superiority. A virgin slave in a bridal veil wasn't a wife. She was proof a victor offered to the highest-ranking predator and applauded by the rest. For Rome, glory demanded spectacle, and for the captive, there was no curtain to hide behind. 9. The curse of the eunuch spies. In the cold calculations of Roman strategy, flesh was just another tool. Nowhere was that clearer than in the creation of eunuch spies, young boys castrated not for punishment, but for purpose. These boys weren't criminals. They were chosen, groomed, and mutilated to serve the empire from within its enemies' walls. The procedure came first. Brutal, painful, and often fatal. Those who survived were trained like weapons, educated in languages, etiquette, and the art of seduction. Their role wasn't to fight with swords, but with silence, charm, and proximity. Sent into royal courts, temples, and noble households, they were expected to blend in, to serve, and to listen. Eunuchs were uniquely trusted in many Eastern cultures. Their altered bodies made them safe, especially around women. Roman intelligence used this to their advantage. The boys infiltrated palaces, warmed beds, poured wine, and whispered into the ears of kings. They remembered conversations others forgot. And when the time came, they passed those secrets back to their handlers, quietly, invisibly, without credit or acknowledgement. They were spies, they were slaves, and they were disposable. Some lasted for years, others died quickly, from infection, exposure, or betrayal. None were honored, none were protected. When their usefulness faded, they vanished sold, replaced, or silenced. No letters exist in their names, no statues bear their likeness. We know them only through fragments, clinical mentions in military logs, coded references in imperial dispatches, and vague warnings from enemy rulers who feared their presence but could never prove it. The Roman state built its empire on strategy, not sentiment. These boys were never mourned. Their bodies were altered, their identities erased, and their lives consumed by a machine that didn't care who bled, as long as someone listened. Their silence still echoes. 10. Homosexuality in the ranks, conditional, brutal, hypocritical. In the Roman army, sex between men wasn't forbidden, it was regulated. It had rules, boundaries, and consequences. A soldier could dominate a male slave and still be seen as honorable. But if he submitted, if he played the passive role, his career, reputation, and identity were shattered. This wasn't about morality, it was about power. The Roman military viewed sexual roles as extensions of hierarchy. To penetrate was to command. To be penetrated was to surrender authority. Soldiers who broke that code weren't judged for their desires, but for allowing themselves to be conquered physically and symbolically. The contradiction ran deep. Male slaves were used regularly. Young prisoners were passed around camps. Senior officers kept boy servants without shame. And yet, to call a man soft or accuse him of being the passive partner was grounds for legal action or lethal violence. Even a rumor could destroy a career. Emperors themselves played both sides. Hadrian openly loved Antinous, and statues of the boy adorned cities across the empire. Nero married a eunuch in a public ceremony. These displays were tolerated, celebrated even because power insulated them. But for ordinary soldiers, the same behavior meant disgrace. Hypocrisy wasn't the exception, it was the system. Graffiti in barracks mocked effeminate men. Insults about sexual roles sparked duels and death. The line wasn't drawn at same-sex contact, it was drawn at perceived weakness. A soldier could use others. He could never be used. Behind closed tents, the truth played out freely. But in the light of day, denial was mandatory. The legion marched under banners of discipline, but within its ranks, secrecy, exploitation, and sexual politics rotted the core. Rome didn't ban homosexuality, it weaponized it, and for every man exposed, there were dozens who lived behind masks, trapped by a code that demanded silence over truth. 11th. Sacred prostitution in Roman temples. When Roman legions moved east, they didn't just conquer land, they absorbed customs. One of the most unsettling was the adoption of sacred prostitution. Soldiers, many far from home and stripped of restraint, engaged in sexual rituals within temples, justifying the acts as religious devotion. What was once considered perversion became spiritual purification under the temple roof. Temples dedicated to goddesses like Venus, Isis, and Astarte became the epicenters of this practice. Prostitutes, often enslaved or raised for the role from childhood, were considered vessels of the divine. Soldiers lined up to pay for what priests called blessings, convinced or pretending to believe that the act cleansed their souls or granted favor in battle. Both male and female prostitutes were used. Gender mattered less than availability. The soldier offered coin and received a body, sometimes with prayers, incense, or chants, but always under the guise of holiness. The temple took its cut. The army looked the other way. The line between worship and exploitation vanished completely. Participation was encouraged, even expected. Some commanders saw it as a way to maintain discipline better in the temples than in the streets, they reasoned. In truth, it created a system where religious authority and sexual access were intertwined. Sacred ground became a marketplace for indulgence. The priests didn't object, the soldiers didn't question, and the victims had no say. Their bodies became instruments of empire, wrapped in myth, offered as devotion. Rome prided itself on law and order, but in these temples, it sanctioned the opposite. Spirituality became a veil for consumption. Piety became performance. And beneath the marble columns, soldiers knelt not in prayer, but in conquest, cloaking desire in ritual, while erasing the line between sin and sacrament. 12. The ritual of blood and seed. For Roman soldiers, superstition walked beside steel. Beyond strategy and swordsmanship, many believed power came from something primal: blood and semen. Together, these fluids were thought to carry life force, strength, and divine favor. And in the hidden corners of the empire, some soldiers practiced dark, intimate rituals to harness it. Before battle, units gathered in shrines carved into rock or buried beneath barracks. There, rites were performed, whispered, undocumented, but preserved in scraps of scrolls and fragmented murals. Blood from self-inflicted wounds or from animals was mixed with semen taken from slaves, fellow soldiers, or even captured gladiators. The concoction was then smeared across armor, poured onto weapons, or in extreme cases, ingested. These rituals weren't widespread, but they were real. Gladiator sweat and fluids were sold in markets, believed to cure disease or enhance virility. Some fighters were forced to masturbate before combat, so their essence could be bottled and consumed. Soldiers believed that absorbing the seed of a strong man transferred his power. The same went for blood. Combined, they became a sacred cocktail of dominance. Scrolls found in military temples speak of blessings by heat and salt, anointment of the lower essence, and binding the strength of another. The language is coded, but the intent is clear: to steal life through ritual and to enter battle soaked in more than just steel and prayer. Commanders ignored it. Results mattered more than purity. If a ritual made a man fight harder, superstition was tolerated. To outsiders, it looked like madness. But within the legion, it was faith, a twisted blend of fear, desire, and desperation. In the end, Roman soldiers didn't just fight for the gods. Some believed they became them, fueled by a sacrament of flesh, soaked in blood and marked by seed. 13. The hidden diaries of Roman camp followers. They were known as lupa, the she-wolves of the Roman legions. Not warriors, not citizens, just bodies assigned to the fringe of the marching empire. For centuries, their stories were erased, their voices silenced beneath layers of glory and conquest. But a few scraps of their truth survived: diaries written in haste, hidden in pottery shards, tucked beneath floorboards, never meant to be found. What they wrote was not poetry. It was pain. These journals reveal an organized system of abuse. Some lupa were assigned daily quotas: 10 men, 15, sometimes more. Failure brought punishment. Disobedience meant replacement. Their bodies were inventory, value measured by how many men could use them before collapse. Girls as young as 9 were inducted. Training meant beatings, exposure to rape, and being forced to watch others until fear taught obedience. One entry describes a girl locked in a tent with a centurion and told 14. The emperor's law, what was permitted and what wasn't Rome, prided itself on law. It wrapped brutality in legal codes, called conquest order, and declared itself the bringer of civilization. But behind the marble statues and scrolls of justice lay a chilling truth. Roman law cared deeply about who you were. If you were a citizen, you had rights. If you were a slave, you were property. And property could be used however its owner pleased. Emperor Augustus and his successors introduced morality laws meant to protect Roman values. Adultery became a crime. Public lewdness could lead to exile. Rape of a free-born Roman woman, severe penalties. But those same laws made a clear, brutal distinction. Slaves and captives didn't count. They had no legal personhood. Violating them wasn't considered rape. It was considered usage. For soldiers, the message was simple: touch a citizen without consent, face punishment. Touch a slave? Do as you please. The law didn't just allow this, it encouraged it by omission. Manuals instructed officers to maintain discipline except where non-citizen bodies were concerned. Flesh was part of the spoils. No questions asked. Legal records show trials where soldiers were convicted for assaulting Roman matrons, but not for raping entire villages of conquered women. Captive girls were bought, shared, traded like wine and horses. Even children weren't exempt. Age didn't matter. Status did. The contradiction wasn't hidden, it was policy. Rome claimed virtue while protecting vice. It honored decency while enabling exploitation. The same system that outlawed adultery among nobles turned a blind eye to mass sexual violence in the provinces. For Roman soldiers, the lesson was clear. Authority granted access. Rank granted immunity. And behind every law carved in stone was a warning: power protects itself, not the powerless. Justice in Rome had boundaries, and the enslaved never stood on the right side of the line. 15th, a legacy of shame and silence. Rome celebrated its soldiers as paragons of discipline, strength, and civilization. Statues were raised in their honor. Poems praised their valor. Emperors built empires on their backs. But beneath the medals and marble lay something darker, a world of sexual violence so calculated, so embedded, it mirrored the battlefield itself. What the legions did with swords, they also did with flesh. Rape was not random, it was ritual. Domination was not deviance, it was doctrine. From the delicati in the tents to the temple prostitutes on foreign soil, from the mock marriages to the mutilated eunuch spies. Rome turned bodies into tools of war and power. These practices weren't hidden accidents, they were normalized, taught, passed down like tactics. Soldiers learned early. Control was everything. Submission was weakness, and the powerless slaves, captives, children were fair game. Consent didn't matter. Only status did. Modern history books rarely speak of this. They focus on aqueducts, law, roads, and philosophy. But the sexual machinery behind Rome's expansion shaped something deeper and more enduring, the very idea of conquest as a masculine ideal. The belief that power is proven through possession, that strength is measured in who you can take, use, and discard without consequence. The silence around this history isn't an accident, it's by design. These truths tarnish the myth of Roman greatness. They expose the cost of empire in blood and violation. And they remind us that civilization, when built on the backs of the voiceless, is just violence in disguise. Rome fell, its legions vanished, but its legacy lingers in law, in language, in the quiet parts of power we still refuse to question. And buried beneath the ruins is not just stone, but the stories of those never meant to survive, only to be used, forgotten, and erased.